What's happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm here to review the new flick T2 Trainspotting, which has been out around the world for a while now, but it's just arriving in the States, so this is the first opportunity I had to see it. This is a film not to be confused with the T2 from the early 90s, but it is actually the sequel to the film Trainspotting from the 90s, a movie that, for my generation, is one of those movies that defines that decade. If you were a film lover in the 90s, there were certain foreign films and independent films that made film seem very dangerous and very alive and very open to infinite possibilities. And I was, I think, a sophomore in college when Trainspotting came out, and it just blew our minds. The soundtrack was in everybody's room for months. Everybody wanted to try as many drugs as possible, which is probably the wrong lesson to learn from Trainspotting. But it was a movie that it conquered the imagination of young filmgoers. Movies like Pulp Fiction. But one of the reasons Trainspotting had such an impact on me at that time is that I was just beginning to get obsessed with movies. I hadn't taken any internships out in LA yet or done anything involved in the movie business, but I was starting to get completely rabid and movie obsessed. When I heard that they were going to do a sequel, I was slightly cautiously optimistic. It'd be like if Tarantino said today he wanted to do a sequel to Pulp Fiction. People were like, ooh, I don't know. That said, though, Danny Boyle has continued to be an incredibly exciting filmmaker for the last 20 years. I mean, 28 Days Later, I think single-handedly resurrected the zombie genre because the remake of Dawn of the Dead, movies like Shaun of the Dead, they all came after, but 28 Days Later all of a sudden made zombies very viable and terrifying again in the 21st century. I thought Steve Jobs was absolutely sensational. I know a lot of people shat on it, but I saw it 3 times, and I think it really captured these 3 different pivotal moments in Steve Jobs' career in a really fascinating cinematic way. It provided a lot of fascinating insight into a man who is arguably one of the most important innovators in the history of American business. 127 hours, very, very gripping, intense movie. I mean, Danny Boyle, he has plenty of misses. I mean, does anybody pine for the days of A Life Less Ordinary? Not I. But who knows? Maybe there's some people out there who really like A Life Less Ordinary. I remember at the time thinking, how can I get out of this theater? This is atrocious. But I really like also his film Shallow Grave. I was actually studying abroad when that movie came out, and I actually saw it in London upon its initial release. And I didn't even know movies could be like that. I mean, I was a typical American moviegoer. I thought all movies had to be like Universal Soldier. And all of a sudden I saw this thriller, Shallow Grave, that was a total eye-opener. So I've always been a big Danny Boyle fan. Which brings me to T2 Trainspotting. Now, obviously, you're talking about these characters 20 years after the fact. So they're no longer 20-something junkies sprinting through the streets of Edinburgh, raising hell and having the time of their lives and betraying each other and fucking everything in sight. It's no longer that kind of madcap experience. This is very much a movie about aging, which doesn't necessarily sound as sexy and exciting as the original film because these guys are all in their 40s now. Some of them are pushing 50, and their lives have not turned out remotely how they thought they would. They've encountered failure and disappointment and betrayal pretty much every step of the way. And now circumstances are bringing these 4 friends back together again after an incredibly long hiatus. And I have to say, emotionally, this was the far more moving of the 2 movies. I'm 40. These guys are obviously a slightly older age group. But watching this movie made me want to call all my old friends from college and invite them out for a drink and get totally shit-faced. It felt very much like a great reunion with your friends who perhaps take you to the dark side when you ought to be a little more mature and grown up at this point. But it definitely makes you want to try and go out and reminisce and have these sentimental journeys because a lot of this movie is through the perspective of Renton, Ewan McGregor's character, who basically is going through a sentimental journey through a lot of his memories initially when he returns to Scotland because he's been away for 15, 20 years in Amsterdam, living with his wife, and now his life has kind of fallen to pieces and he's back in Scotland. It should be noted that Irvine Welsh, the original author who created all these characters, and he's written, I think, a prequel, and he also wrote a sequel all about Bigby later on down the road. He's continued to play around these characters over the course of his career as an author. He's involved in the script, so I don't feel like there's anything about this movie that is betrayal of Irvine Welsh's original creation, and it'd be interesting to see what he plans to do with these characters now this movie's out there, because I feel like in a lot of ways this could have been Danny Boyle's last movie. If he wanted to retire, this would have been a good one to retire on, unless he's planning on revisiting these characters in yet another 20 years, which is totally possible. But I have to say, if the first movie was just like going to the coolest, craziest rock concert you've ever been to where drugs and alcohol are flowing all over the place, this one felt just like a great kind of bittersweet sad reunion where you're very, very glad to see everybody, but everybody's got a few more wisdom lines. They got a bit of more of a belly, a little bit more gray in the hair. You see the effects of time. However, it's also very inspiring because these guys, they decide to essentially try to do one last get rich quick scheme and create a brothel. And of course, nothing goes according to plan, and they all can't help but turn on one another. But it is fun watching them work together again, especially when the character of Sick Boy and Renton really start to bond again, and they start, because periodically throughout the film you see little flashbacks from the first movie, and you see their experiences as children together. You see their experiences first trying heroin together and sharing needles and becoming blood brothers and that sort of thing. And while some guys like Begbie might have completely hit rock bottom and he's basically forced to break his way out of jail just to have a little bit of a life before he dies of old age, on the other hand, you've got Kelly Macdonald's character, Diane, who not only has moved on, but has absolutely thrived and is now a very successful lawyer and is actually brought in to help out when Sick Boy gets into a little bit of legal trouble. The X factor in this movie, and my favorite part of this movie, is a newcomer who plays the character Veronica. It's an actress whose name is Angela Nedjalkova. I think she's Bulgarian. She is kind of the business associate slash girlfriend of Sick Boy, who starts to fall in love with Renton, and her commentary on the way these friends are behaving with one another is incredibly hysterical. If I were a young moviegoer and I went to see this out of context, I would probably think it's a pretty cool character-driven movie about middle-aged guys trying to get by in Scotland. But for people who love the original film, it's going to feel very much like a homecoming, and it's going to be an absolute blast. And you'll feel like you're pulling up a chair next to a warm fire and hanging out with old friends. So I strongly encourage people to check it out. I can't review the film objectively on its own terms because I've got so much sentimental affection for the time period where I first discovered Trainspotting. I mean, I was a 20-year-old dude, and any movies and or music you discover at the time, you're naturally going to be very protective of and very sentimental about. And so a sequel that returns and revisits these characters, it strikes me emotionally in a way that it's not going to have the same impact on somebody who's discovering all these characters for the first time. However, who knows? Maybe it'll encourage people to go back and watch the first movie and they'll fall in love with it and they'll have a similar experience. I just really can't say. But if you are late 30s, early 40s, and you were part of that Trainspotting revolution back in the 90s, all I can say is you're going to have an absolute blast watching Trainspotting 2. And if you live abroad, you're not in the United States, chances are you've already seen this movie because I think it's already a pretty sizable success overseas in Europe. So yeah, for whatever reason, America, we got it late, but better late than never. I had an absolute blast. I'm glad to see Danny Boyle back in action. I guess he didn't have really much of a hiatus at all after Steve Jobs. He went right into production on this. So it'll be interesting to see what he does with the latter part of his career, because you definitely get the sense that this movie is a chance for him to exhale, assess, kind of see where he stands in his career before he moves into essentially what will be the latter part of his career. But I hope he stays in business and keeps making movies for a very long time because he's got chops to spare. So, hope you enjoyed this review. Please give me a subscribe if you feel so inclined to do so. Have an awesome weekend at the movies. There's a lot of stuff to check out, like Terrence Malick's Song to Song. There's the live-action remake of Beauty and the Beast. I'll probably pass on Beauty and the Beast because I love the cartoon as a kid, and I just don't feel like tainting those memories, but I probably will be definitely checking out Song to Song by Terrence Malick. So, at any rate, hope everyone has a great time this weekend, and yeah, give me a shout on Twitter anytime at Colbrax if you want to talk about flicks. Talk to y'all later.